and we will get started. All right, so welcome everyone on this beautiful Friday night in April. Hopefully it's feeling like springtime wherever you are this evening, from coast to coast, and even in Canada, regardless of the fact that there is a snowstorm yet on its way. We are thrilled to have you joining us this evening for what is this second complimentary panel discussion with Richard Tarnas and Michael Conforti. Relative to archetypal cosmology and archetypal patterning, Michael and Rick are going to be discussing some of the themes that they will be teaching on and presenting on. If you can imagine this right now, putting yourself in that beautiful, beautiful space at Eranos on the lake, overlooking the lake, and sitting around the table where Jung and Neumann and so many of the greats sat and taught and had deep conversations of psyche and soul. So tonight I want to welcome each and every one of you. I want to say thank you to Tony Dianca, who is organizing that this week in July 22nd through the 27th. If you have not yet registered or signed up and you're thinking about it or contemplating it, I would really strongly encourage you not to wait to go ahead and reserve your spot. That is in July. It is tourist season, so hotels are filling up very quickly. So you can get all the information at Tony's website, tonydianca.com. It's all on there. You can contact us at Assisi or contact Rick. We will get you to where you need to be to get all the information. This evening, if we can take a deep breath from wherever life has found us all, and cross a threshold into that space where the archetypes live and breathe and dance and move. That's where we're going this evening as Michael and Rick take us across that threshold. For those of you who don't have the privilege of knowing, I'm sure many of you do, and many of you are very familiar with their work, but for those of you who may not be, let me start by introducing you. Richard Tarnas is the founding director of the graduate program in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He teaches courses in the history of ideas, archetypal studies, depth psychology, and religious evolution. He frequently lectures on archetypal studies and depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, and was formerly the director of programs and education at Esalen Institute in Big Sur. He is the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, A History of the Western Worldview from the Ancient Greek to the Postmodern, widely used in universities, and his second book, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network, and is the basis for an upcoming documentary film, Changing of the Gods. That's so exciting.
Congratulations.
I can't wait to see that. Rick is a past president of the International Transpersonal Association and served on the Board of Governors for the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. Michael Conforti is a Jungian analyst and founder and director of the Assisi Institute, the International Center for the Study of Archetypal Patterns. As a pioneer in the field of matter-psyche studies, he has taught alongside many of the world leaders in Jungian psychology, psychoanalysis, and the sciences, including Ervin Laszlo, Beverly Rubik, Mei-Wan Ho, David Peat, Mario Jacobi, Urim Kaufman, and Robert Langs. For more than 30 years, his work has addressed the relationship and expression of archetypes within the psyche and the material world, and its role in literally structuring the dynamics occurring within the therapeutic relationship. In addition to his clinical practice and work at the Assisi Institute, he maintains lectures here and abroad, including at the C.G. Jung Institute of Zurich and Jungian organizations in Australia, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Italy, Russia, and Venezuela. His books, Field, Form, and Fate, Patterns in Mind, Psyche, and Nature, are published in Italian and English, and his book, Threshold Experiences, is translated into both Italian and Russian. So, Michael and Rick, thank you both so much for generously spending time with all of us this evening and sharing your scholarship and your experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good to be here, and thank you, Laura, for moderating us for tonight.
You're very welcome. So let's start. We have some really big questions and some really deep topics to dive into in the next little over 60 minutes that we have ahead of us, and we will open this up for questions towards the end of this evening. So getting us started, I want to start with this question. And, Michael and Rick, you both submitted some big questions, and one of them is similar. So I'm going to try and take both the questions and paraphrase it and hand it to both of you. The question is this. As we consider the state of the world today, and as many of us were reading in our Facebook news feeds and opening our news feeds here in the United States, the latest round, and looking at the world from what some would say is a hyper-political frame of mind. Can you each say something about how the archetypal perspective, bringing an archetypal perspective to our world, might be helpful for us? So, Rick, I'm going to let you open it, and then we'll hand that same question over to Michael.
Okay, I was looking forward to hearing Michael first, but I'll be happy to go forward since you suggested it. When we think of the state of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the collective psyche, we're all embedded in a larger collective psyche. That was Jung's great insight near the very beginning of his career, recognizing how much we are, in each of us as individual psyches, are embedded in an archetypal psyche, an archetypally informed collective psyche that is shared by all humanity, but goes so deep that we inherit it from many generations of humanity, and before that, it's embedded in our entire phylogenetic inheritance. And I would say not only in terms of an inheritance, but also in terms of the present moment. When we think of something like many people present symptoms these days of dealing with like a kind of non-specific grief or a mourning, and that has been recognized by many, for example, eco-psychologists, which is a form of depth psychology, that in some ways we are very likely participating in a kind of in the state of the earth community as a whole. So in all these respects, when we are trying to understand ourselves, our own individual lives, we need to recognize that we are participating in much larger wholes, much larger kind of holistic psycho-spiritual beings or entities or like a psyche that is in turn archetypally informed. That the archetypes seem to be the great universal principles that inform us, shape our perceptions, the metaphors we use, the emotional quality of the experience that we have is to a tremendous extent shaped by these archetypal principles or complexes. For the ancients, it was gods and goddesses. They took that kind of a form, very directly mythological. They weren't just imagining. It was something that was directly experienced. And even before gods and goddesses emerged, it was powerful spirits that, for example, in a primordial tribal ceremony or ritual, you would feel those spirits entering into one and shaping one's experience. So when we bring the archetypal perspective to the present moment, I find it particularly useful on two levels. One is drawing on the insight that Jung particularly brought into the modern world that the astrological tradition has carried, namely that in this intrinsically interconnected universe, it seems that the movements of the planets are also deeply connected to the patterns and dynamics, the movements of the collective psyche and of our own individual psyche, and specifically from that the planets, the sun, the moon, have archetypal meanings, correlations, and when we are able to track carefully those movements, that gives us an insight. And this was Jung's starting really very early in his career, and particularly from the 1930s on. He was using astrology very deeply in his work with patients. So using that perspective, we're able to highlight what archetypal principles or complexes are most being constellated at any given time. And in our own era, we're going through a very powerful period, comparable to the last time we had the alignment that we're going through right now, Uranus-Pluto alignment, was in the 1960s, 60 to 72, which had a very similar quality of very powerful energies, activated political, social turmoil, impulses for reform, rebellion, revolution, but also a kind of awakening of the id, of the will to power, of shadow dimensions of the deep psyche that can overtake a culture as well as an individual. So, of course, there's much more to this film that I'm involved in making right now. Is going to be bringing that, is completely focused on that. I just spent the weekend recording some of the soundtrack at the Skywalker Ranch studios, and so it's very much on my mind. So it's that type of thing that I'll explore more deeply in July at Eranos. But it's a singular source of insight, and in this era, we need as many sources of deep insight as possible to deal with our critical moment.
Rick, thank you. That was a wonderful response to a very deep question. And now, Michael, going to you. You have spent the last 30 years, if not more, developing your work relative to the Assisi Institute, looking at archetypal patterns in both individual and collective experience. And I happen to know fairly well some of the themes, since you and I spend a lot of time talking about them and have opportunity to. But this quote from Jung, Michael, I think is a great lead-in as you go into bringing your perspective of archetypal patterning and what that can bring to our current understanding of the world and world events. Jung said this in The Collective Works: the collective unconscious is anything but an encapsulated personal system. It is sheer objectivity as wide as the world. It is sheer objectivity as wide as the world. So, Michael, if you can maybe talk to us and respond to us relative to, the insight that comes from bringing an archetypal understanding to these world events.
Well, thanks, and hopefully what I'll say will add. Well, build on what Rick said, because Rick ended talking about patterns of psyche in a lot of ways. I think everything we see in individual behavior is really an expression of something much deeper. Generally, and this is sort of a blow to our egos, we're taken over. Much of our lives, we're taken over by archetypal forces, by archetypal patterns, we get caught in a vortex, we don't even know what our behaviors are. And this happens in the collective. And Jung was one of the great spokespersons for this, especially when we look back at the time of Nazi Germany, what was happening. And he looked at it from the perspective of someone who wanted to understand, what is this movement about? It's an epiphenomena of something. Something is driving it. You can't just say this is one person doing one thing and then everyone's rallying around this particular person to this atrocity we now know as the Holocaust. But he tried to understand that this was an emergence of some very dark aspect of the collective unconscious now emerging into the collective. With that, he set a precedent. In the same way, I think I mentioned last time we talked, he had a very similar reaction on the positive side to the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. He was on fire with that. You can imagine him in his own Swiss way, jumping up and down, whatever his expression of excitement was. He knew that it was some world-changing event. So he was looking at everything as though it was a dream, as though it was psyche telling its story. So if you look at the world today from an archetypal perspective, number one, I love the way you talk about it, Rick, from an astrological point of view, that we're in a cycle. We're in some period that we've known before. It's nothing new. There may be new players, a few new turns and twists and turns, but history has known this. So if you have the eye of an archetypal eye looking at patterns, okay, what are we looking at? And I would say, well, you have two major pieces on the table right now. One, and again, Jung was really the first and one of the only therapists of his time, and even today's time, that talked about morality. And there were many debates between Freud and Jung about, is morality inborn or whatever. And Freud said, no, it's not inborn. We get it from the tribal fathers. And Jung said, well, where do they get it from? Thus he went back again to the archetypal. So if we look at what's happening today as, I don't want to call it a purging, but something emerging out of the unconscious, we're seeing that there is some domain that seems to be bereft of morality, of shame. And I take that word shame from a colleague that said in our time today, one of the things we're seeing in so many governmental policies and attitudes is an absence of shame. And then, we all want to think of it. Most of us have been through some kind of analysis, being pretty well educated, and probably come out similarly, politically, whatever. But to realize that this attitude is so deeply embedded in psyche that we would have the tremendous perturbation and upset qualities that we're having in a culture today, it's so disturbing. But I think you got to say, look, it's something coming out that's been there. And the next thing is, and this is where I think Jung was also great. He said, while Freud wanted to look at the dream as a railroad to the unconscious, he looked at the complex. So you could say we are in a huge collective complex right now. If one could understand what may be some transgressions of innate moral codes, what may be some transgressions of issues of shame or whatever, could it be that if the culture puts it, if we see this in our face every day, there can be some healing that takes place? So that's what I would look at. I mean, look, some people say the current government regime has done wonderful things for the feminine. There's been so many uprising of feminine groups, of women taking action. So yeah, I think Rick and I would come at a very similar place with this, that everything that's coming out is an expression of a psychic entity that's been pent up and needs to come out to express itself so we can then understand what we're dealing with. And then the next part of the work is try to articulate the specifics.
Maybe I could just, that's great, Michael, and it makes me think there's just one other thing I wanted to add. Of course, it will just be a headline for future unpacking, and that is, at one level, this is nothing new in the sense that these archetypal powers have been around forever. They're taking a new form. There's cycles involved. The cycle we're in is in a sense that, among other things, in terms of the astrological perspective, it's both like the 1960s, and the one before that was the square in the 1930s. And in a sense, we kind of have a choice between the 60s and the 30s right now. At least both sets of energies are constellated. But there's another level at which something new is happening. That there's both the cyclical view of time, and I believe that's valid, but there's an arrow. There's an unfolding in history that's going on right now. And in some respects, we have never faced a situation, and I'm not just talking about our national crisis, as unprecedented as that is, but the Earth community has never faced this condition before. We are in an encounter with planetary transformation on a level that hasn't been seen since 66 million years ago, and never in human history. And so in this kind of encounter with, let's call it a kind of mortality, a collective mortality, species, our own species, many species, the state of the entire Cenozoic era is being destabilized. And this, like any like near-death experience, for example, or profound spiritual emergency, brings forth a moral crisis and a potential for moral transformation as nothing else can. And that's one reason why I think, in agreement with the last point that Michael just made, as fraught and profoundly troubling as so much that's going on in our time is for all of us, at the same time, there are certain potentials that are being that are now on the horizon, that are now available, that are being pressed into being by the very nature of the crisis we're in. And in that respect, it very much resembles a kind of certain stages of what Jung called the individuation process, Campbell's hero's journey, the death rebirth process of many ancient shamanic and mystery religions and so forth. So that's a whole nother dimension, I think, of our present time that the archetypal perspective can help us have insight into.
Can I just add a little highlight on that in terms of, you put two pieces together, Rick. You mentioned that these are stages we've seen, dynamics we've seen before, and also the potential for novelty and complexity to emerge. I love it. I think we all live with the hope things can be different. We're going to come through things. There's going to be healing, some new generativity and all that. That's wonderful. And that helps us wake up in the morning, that it can be different when we're in rough times. But the thing that I think we're both addressed here, and a piece that really always puts me on fire, is when you say, look, these are times that have been etched into the collective psyche since the beginning of time. These are universal patterns. We've had it. I mean, this is your field, not mine, in terms of the astrology, and you know all that work. I know it differently. But when you say, my God, you know, culture, civilization, humanity has gone through these stages before, different outcomes, and that's where, in the new sciences, they talk about the emergence of complexity. Complexity can come from replicative systems. So you replicate, we're back in the same, maybe say the 30s and 50s or 60s, whatever, similar dynamics, something new can come. That's the prayer, you know, that complexity, and we do whatever we can to help fertilize that soil to make something wonderful grow. But here's why I want to say this, is because I think that the piece I find is being lost today in our love of analytical psychology, Jung's work, archetypal dynamics and all, is the piece that can acknowledge these are universals. There are universals. And that doesn't mean we're caught. It doesn't mean we're gerbils in a cage. It doesn't mean any of that. It doesn't mean we're shackled to some Procrustean bed and we have to be there forever. It means that, yeah, there are patterns. There are genetic patterns. There are morphogenetic patterns. There are astrological patterns. There are marital patterns, you know, from the beginning stage, the flirtation stage, early stage, I don't know. There's something so profound in acknowledging. It's one of the things I really admire about your work and why I'm so glad to be working together. And I know Laura has a lot of this work as well. So it's a great, you know, it's great that we're all having this discussion. But I just want to highlight that piece because I feel that in many, many circles, that's the issue that gets overlooked. Let's look for new hope. Let's look for complexity. Let's hope it's going to be different. Yes, great. But there's something that happens when one could acknowledge and know something about these universal patterns. And then say, look, you know, if we stay in this pattern, if there's not a perturbation, if there's nothing to shake it up, there's a likely scenario that could happen if change doesn't occur. I just want to add that piece, because you put them together, and I wanted to highlight that piece because it's a really profound comment.
Well, thank you.
Thank
you, Rick and Michael. To be continued at Eranos. And I think, look, these are incredible themes. Then what you're both highlighting and what you're both bringing, Rick from the cosmology and astrological, Michael from the spiral of history and the objectivity of these archetypal patterns that we see repeating themselves, and the understanding that there is a universality to them. And I'm going to share this because it leads right into the next question, and I think it also may pull together the threads of this conversation. In opening my news feed the other day, I saw a story of police officers in Uganda. And this is just maybe can bring an illustration to the reality of what you're both talking about. There were police officers in Uganda, and this Ugandan village was experiencing horrific violence directed against women, to the degree that there were something like 20 young girls and young women that had been violently murdered within the last few months. And the villagers were beside themselves, the police were beside themselves. And so what they did was the police, and it showed a video, you can go on and find it. I'm happy to email people the link to it, but you can go on and actually see this. These police officers, these Ugandan police officers, walked through the streets carrying babies that they had on their, like, tied to their backs in the traditional way, and pots, clay pots. Now, when you read Neumann's The Great Mother, in the very last chapter, he refers to one of the Eleusinian mystery rites, where part of those rites were men walking through the streets carrying pots. So both Michael's point of these archetypal patterns have a universality and they're repeating themselves, and also Rick, to this emergence of something new. You know, that yes, these patterns are repeating themselves, but there's something new that's coming through as well. So with that, if we can go to this next question, Rick, you have talked about this, the important issue of feminism and archetypes, and the feminist critique of the archetypal perspective. Could you say something about this, and how, in your view, we can honor both feminist values as well as the power of the archetypal perspective?
Yes, it's a very important dialogue about these issues, because some feminists have brought up the point, and I think it's a very important and understandable point, that the archetypal perspective can be and has been used at times to justify, for example, certain assumptions about a class of persons, or like about what is appropriate, or what is natural for, let's say, a woman to be, or for a man to be, and it's particularly, of course, around the issues of gender that the feminist critique came in, and the point there is that when an archetypal principle is basically confused with the local cultural version of that archetype, and then that local current cultural version is seen as being the archetypal way of being, the universal, the natural way, then it is very possible for, because the archetypal has the numinous dimension, one can say, well, there's an emotional charge. There's a sense that this is what's sacred about being a woman, or about being a man, or about what a marriage should be. Like the whole sacred marriage archetype can be seen in one era or one culture in one form, and then very different in another form. And the clarification that needs to come in is the recognition that the archetypes are at a very high level of universality. They exist with a tremendous range of potential inflections or expressions. Even on the individual level, we see that, for example, the mother archetype came through in your mother and in my mother, and expressed itself and was experienced by each of us in particular ways. And that's true in different cultural mythologies, the different mother archetypes. Virgin Mary is very different than Kali, for example. Yet both are essentially mythic forms, one Western, the other Indian, Asian, that are powerful renderings or expressions or concrete embodiments of the universal principle. And I think we always have to be. See, the problem is that even Jung was at times susceptible to falling into that confusion between the particular frame of reference that he was living in. He lived in a very patriarchal era, and despite all the tremendous breakthroughs and strides he made on behalf of the empowerment of women, deepening our appreciation of women's psychology and of the role of the feminine in the larger human psyche. At the same time, he can make statements that are embarrassing about what is when he talks about the anima or the animus, or about what is appropriate for a man or a woman to be. And so if we recognize the multivalence of the archetypes, the way they can express themselves it also evolves over time. We're seeing in our time a powerful transformation and evolution of the feminine archetype that simply wasn't on the horizon 100 years ago. And so I think we can have both the archetypal perspective and actually bring clarity to feminist values and concerns. And those feminist values and concerns can correct certain liabilities in the archetypal perspective as it may be framed at any given point. So that's when we could go into more detail, and of course we will in another setting about the the fact that I think it's helpful to bring in ideas such as if the feminine is just identified as being connected to nurturance and relationality and connection with feeling and with the body and intuition, then if it is somehow seen as being not connected to a capacity for the warrior archetype, or for being for rationality, or for autonomy, for independent individuality, then this puts a kind of puts the feminine into a straitjacket. And whenever we talk about the feminine, even if we're talking about it in both men and women, it is impossible to speak about it without thinking primarily about women's psychology. And when Jungians generally write about a book on the feminine, they are the primary focus will be on women's psychology. And so I think it's helpful to bring in the fact that the feminine archetype can have, for example, a solar or a lunar quality. It can be connected. It can take on an Aphrodite quality, but also Mars, the warrior. All those are potentials within the richness of the feminine, and it's I think important to not fall into the confusion of collapsing the archetypal level into the local cultural stereotype of what the feminine or the masculine is.
Well, thank you. This is a huge topic, and one that, as you and Michael both know, I am hugely invested in, relative to, understanding and bringing, a feminine gaze, as, to our understanding of the archetypal motifs. And Jung said it. He said we are all a product of our times. He did recognize that. We can only get so far outside of our times. That's to be recognized. I think what we're seeing today is an emergence, in many ways, standing on the shoulders of some incredible scholarship of women. Von Franz, Anne Ulanov, some incredible scholarship that's out there and continues to be put out there that helps us to take a different lens through which to see the archetypal ideas and energies that are out there and where they're going. And it's not only women that are put in that straitjacket; women and men both are put in that straitjacket. And I think that's part of the emergence of what we're seeing is this creative emergence of saying, no, it's not conscripted to a gendered identity. It's larger than that, and it's more creative. Michael, would you like to respond at all to anything that Rick's had to say?
Yeah, just a couple of pieces. One is, I'll make them brief. One is a strange article I read many years ago about the role of the analyst's religion and cultural background on how they do analysis. And it was a case of an Orthodox Jewish psychoanalyst treating an Orthodox couple, an Orthodox, husband and wife. And anyway, the long story short is that he had some very, very, what can we say, rigid attitudes about the role of the woman. And he presented this to the family, what the woman should do, the Orthodox woman, whatever, as being the right way to live. And it was a good article. It was a very strange piece. But what it opened up is what happens when one has a bias and that comes out as truth. And he wasn't even just talking about, well, I want to make this intervention for this particular Orthodox system. He was just making general comments that this is what women should do. So part A. Part two is something I've been interested in for a long time, is the whole issue, what I call the eclipse of God, where somebody just wrote a comment about this over here, about secondary personalization from Neumann's work, that a lot of times what we then perceive as God and archetypal is really a certain distortion of universal principles. And an article I've been threatening to write for a long time is only God, if only God was made of Teflon. Remember the Teflon Don? Remember Richard John Gotti, they called him the Teflon God because nothing would stick. None of the attempts to get him arrested would stick. You couldn't get the crime to stick on him. Well, unfortunately, with God, almost all of our projections fit. So when we have these attitudes of women as, whatever they say in the Bible about women, and women should be oppressed and whatever, I mean, why would anybody think that that's about the archetype of the feminine as opposed to the archetype of misogyny? And I think we conflate the two all too often. And this is where the archetype itself often becomes conflated with attitudes. It could be the cultural attitudes at the time where people believed about women. Maybe that's where people were at one time. But then when people say, well, that's the feminine. And you're right, Jung made some very bizarre comments, some very insulting and comments that really revealed how much he was caught in his own times. He couldn't get above it with some attitudes. But I think when we begin to, I don't want to say tease apart, but we look at some of these, what we believe are archetypal attitudes, ask, wait a minute, is it the archetype of the feminine we're looking at, or archetype of prejudice? Is this the archetype of misogyny that has been real since the beginning of time, or not? And I think that's where we begin to miss many times what could in fact be a profound universal principle, because it gets eclipsed by this other stuff. I mean, a wonderful book was written by a woman named Carol Delaney. She gave some talks for us. She's a wonderful lady. It's called Abraham on Trial. I don't think I mentioned last time we had our talks. And she said, in all of the child sacrifices in the Bible, from Isaac to all of the stories we have, guess who was never asked if it was okay? The mother. But it was considered sacred. They were always considered sacred sacrifices. In whose eyes? So, I think it takes a much more discerning, disciplined eye and the heart. I think one has to have their heart out when you do this kind of work and look at this stuff. Say, wait a minute, is this really the archetype we're looking at, or is some other archetypal issue coming over so we're not even seeing what may in fact be the archetypal feminine? So I think it takes a lot more discernment for us.
I think, and Michael, I think you're hitting on a really important point, which is the extent to which in any given phenomenon, there's more than one archetype at work.
Exactly.
That's another potential confusion that can happen is where we literalize the archetype and like this is the like that a person is this is my myth, you know, as if there's only one archetypal principle or set of complexes that are going through one. We are each the meeting point of many different archetypal forces going on at any given point, and at any moment, every moment is a meeting point and a kind of concrescence, to use Whitehead's term, of many different archetypal forces at work and coming together in the most creative way to bring about a particular phenomenon or quality of the moment. So again, discernment, being able to use that archetypal eye to be able to discern the multiple interactions amongst the different archetypes is very important. Lorley, I'm thinking about one of the things we're doing here is of course, we're describing and praising the archetypal perspective. We're kind of champions of it. We've all here been expanded and elevated by the archetypal perspective in the course of our lives. And whenever you have, one thing we learned from Jung and depth psychology is that whenever you are very fully enthusiastic about something, it's very important to kind of hold the other pole of doubt, about it, or to be able to see the shadow or watch for the critique that could be very relevant. And one other criticism that can be made about the archetypal perspective, and has been occasionally by someone like Naomi Goldenberg, who a feminist scholar and depth psychologist, and that is that one can, whether it's within the context of psychotherapy or just in our own self-reflections, we can use the archetypal perspective as a way of evading the more specific, concrete, biographical event, the relationship we're in, the emotional messiness of what we're going through. And we can say, oh, well, this is really just this archetypal level that's at work, and or how did Hillman put it? I'm a shaman, so I have headaches, and that's really what's going on. And I mean, that may be what's going on, but it could be that the headache is reflecting something else, and it could be that sometimes the archetypal perspective can be used as what we might call, what's been called a spiritual bypass. But this could be an archetypal version of the spiritual bypass, where we're trying to evade or deny dealing with much more human issues by going to that other level. And what Goldenberg's critique is having done therapy with both more of a psychoanalytic orientation, but also and another time with someone who had very much the archetypal perspective. She found she was getting much more help from personally from the person who was having her deal with her object relations in early childhood, for example, or something like that. And I think what's very important here is to recognize that we need to be constantly carrying both of these in a dialogue with each other, because every concrete trauma, messy relationship, or emotional place that we're in is being informed by the archetypal. But that doesn't, just putting the name on it isn't enough. We also have to feel those emotions. We have to work it out in the relationship. And it could be in terms of psychotherapeutic context, we may have to, for example, really come to terms with something that happened to us at 3 years old, or in infancy, or something like that. And that can allow us to open up to a wider transpersonal, a deeper transpersonal level. But the personal work can't be bypassed. It has to be embraced, and the two together are constantly informing each other. The archetypal level, and the more concrete biographical particular level that we are each living through.
I think that's a fantastic point, Rick. Thank you for bringing it up. I mean, you're really talking about the archetypal equivalent of the old religious, well, the devil made me do it, where the, you know, right, the archetypes become the escape route. It becomes the opportunity to keep us from going back to, I think, what Michael was alluding to, our, you know, this moral obligation that we have to bring it to a personal level, to get it out of the world of simply the intellectualizing and the theorizing, and to recognize what is my moral responsibility, what is my ethical responsibility to work with this on a very personal and a very real level. If you are a thinking dominant person, we want to go to the, you may want to go to the theoretical. If you're a feeling dominant, so there's a personal mandate, an ethical mandate. Thank you for bringing that into this conversation. I'm going to put this question out here for both you and Michael, and it's not on the, okay, this is unscripted for all of you listening tonight, but I think it's part of this conversation. When we're talking about these archetypal realities and how we see them within our own culture and through our own lens, as men, as women, as men and women who are living now in this particular moment in history, where and how, and Michael, if you can maybe speak to this first, does the complex, both whether we're talking about the cultural complex, our personal complex, how does that influence our understanding or engagement with these archetypal motifs and these archetypal energies, or does it?
Yeah. No, it's great, and it is a perfect add-on to where Rick was going. On one hand, to both try to address both questions and both pieces that are coming up, a lot of times our belief system are conveniences. Okay, it's not nice to say, it's not, you don't win fans with that, but a lot of times our belief system are really convenient excuses to not live a life because they're part of our complex system. And I had the good fortune, in addition to being trained as a Jungian analyst, I worked with Robert Langs for many years, one of the great analysts of our times. And he was a really unique character, a brilliant man. And one of the things he said, he called up one night, I said, Mike, I got a new idea about religion. He said, you know, when religion talks about good and bad, he said, I have a new take on what's good and what's bad, archetypally and universally. He said, what's bad is the conscious mind, and what's good is the unconscious. And he said, okay, what do you mean? Because this is pretty controversial what you're bringing up here. He said, well, the conscious mind is bad in the sense that it can create realities all the time. It can conflate, it can deny, it can rationalize, it can make whatever truth it wants to be as a truth. And what's good is the unconscious, because the unconscious is unwavering in its need to present truth and objectivity to you. And I got some quotes, we have time, I'll read them, from Elizabeth Osterman, one of the early great Jungians, and then from the scientists saying the same thing. The need for opening up to these vistas where there is something objective. So when Langs made the comment about good and bad, it matches what Elie Wiesel said towards probably the middle part of his career, when he said, with the advent of the rational mind came the capacity to rationalize anything and everything. So that's what we do. We rationalize, we make up ideas. We, like Rick say, we have a headache because I'm a shaman. Maybe you're a shaman, it could be. But a lot of times I think we lose, and here's another tough word, there's a rigor that goes with this work. I mean, archetypal psychology can easily become some party favor. I mean, Jung spent how many years? 60 years. Von Franz spent probably 60 years studying universal motifs as present in fairy tales. They work with patients from all levels. It's not a party. It's not a party game. Look at your life, Rick. You've had how many years studying this stuff? And let me read a little piece. I know, but that's what I'm saying. So the point is great, Lauralee, that I think often that we do get And I say, we get very loose with some profound ideas. Now listen, this is from Elizabeth Osterman back in the 1960s. She was from your part of the woods, Eric.
Yeah, good friend. Yeah.
Well, I love to work. And I called and invited her for Italy one year. And she said, I would love to, but this is my last year of life.
Yeah.
Anyway, she writes an article called The Tendency Towards Patterning and Order in Matter and the Psyche. And this is the attitude that doesn't create all of those constructions of reality and narrative. She writes here, it's so beautiful. Attention was directed to the world of humanity. Of all the great pioneers among Freud and Jung, it was C.G. Jung of Zurich who turned his attention to this inner realm of the psyche. It was part of his genius to regard psychological data such as dreams and fantasy, recurrent mythological themes, etc., as empirical facts, not merely as reflections of the outer world. He studied these as other scientists study their artifacts and readings. In so doing, he made his greatest discovery, the existence of the objective psyche and the presence of autonomous formative tendencies at work in the unconscious. And then she finished, she said, it was because in here. Okay. It soon became apparent that the natural forces I was observing and the scientific data I was studying shared a common characteristic, a tendency towards patterning and order. Oh my God, you want that puts me on fire. And that does away in many ways with all the subjective renderings, with narratives and constructive meanings and biased meanings. Well, we all need to make meaning of things. That's part of the human condition. That's archetypal, to make meaning. However, as Jung taught in many of his stories in his classes and stories I've heard from many people, he would say, look, when it comes to images in the unconscious, you don't have to make meaning of it. It's already implicit. But what we do, many of us do, is we go about and say, well, for me it means, for me it is. The bird, the Uranus, this issue, Eranos means whatever. And we forget that the world wasn't just created to hear our biases. We need to have our biases. We need to paint with our colors. That's part of life. It's part of what makes it beautiful. But we forget then that to appreciate what is archetypal means to engage in that world, not to just appropriate to ourselves some archetypal thing because it feels good. Now I'm a shaman, now I'm this, now I'm whatever. And the other piece I'll add is, from a clinical point of view, the patients that have the highest prevalence of archetypal dreams are psychotic patients.
Sure.
Now that, I'm not saying a bad thing. The point is, there's no ego to catch it. The objective, our archetypal issue is so far removed from the ego, the patient is overwhelmed. And there may be a shamanistic part there, but there's no ego to capture it. There may be a medicine man or a medicine woman in the psyche of that person, but it's so far removed. What happens then with more of a weaker or splintered ego, the content comes up and takes over.
Yeah.
And we lose the work. And again, Jung was a brilliant researcher with all his flaws. Okay, it's a given. It's even silly to say, but they were rigorous in their working with archetypes. And I think we've lost it. Look, I'm not trying to blow smoke with you. One of the things I respect about you is you put in your time. You really work to study these astrological patterns. What some of the features are, what some of the trajectories can be, and what can come when we make changes. So you acknowledge all that. I mean, when von Franz looked at fairy tales, it was a profound acknowledging of a universal pattern. And sure, novelty will come. But when we appropriate to ourselves all of this stuff, with what you're asking, Laura, we appropriate it. Often it becomes the complex, then eclipsing the archetypal, because you see it just through your lens. I look at your red jacket, I see fire trucks, for instance. Well, that could be my fantasy. That could be my particular experience. That's not the whole experience. And when we just say then that what my experience is the archetypal, we could be missing a lot right there. That's where the humility, I think, is needed for this. And to put the word again, some rigor. So
that whole issue of the closeness of the of the psychotic to the archetypal world is an important one, because Jung faced it head on, when he went deep in his own descent there in 1913, 14 through the teens there. He was just, at times he was just so overwhelmed by this influx of archetypal phenomena, basically kind of transpersonal beings presenting themselves to him and speaking to him, and spirits and so forth. And he found himself entering into a very powerful realm, and one in which he had to work very hard to maintain a sense of his own executive agency, of his capacity to integrate it, to handle it, to interact with it, and not be overwhelmed by it. And in a sense, that's another one of the great tensions of opposites that we have to hold here in our work in the archetypal area, but as human beings generally, and that is to simultaneously be able to be in engagement with that, with the deep unconscious, with the archetypal dimension of things, and at the same time maintaining some capacity for critical agency, for autonomy, for being able to not be in a possession state by the complex, because that's a very powerful state to be in when one is possessed, but it can be very destructive indeed. And in a sense, what Jung gave us is the two extremes. If you totally cut yourself off from the archetypal, then you are, as he had one title of an essay called "Modern Man in Search of His Soul." We could say the modern human being, modern consciousness in search of its depths, of its soul. But on the other hand, you have the other danger of entering so fully and unconditionally into the archetypal, or having it enter into you so powerfully that you kind of disappear, and you just and that's where psychosis can happen, or a very profound kind of disorientation of consciousness that can take a lot of work.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, I think when we bring this idea of the complex into how we're able to see and interact with the archetypes and the archetypal energies that we see today, I mean, look at the unbelievable polarization, political polarization, but it really transcends the political. Really what we're seeing is an archetypal possession and a split in the collective consciousness right now. So I want to move into the next question. I'm watching and looking at the clock, and I want to save at least 15, if not more, minutes at the end of this to open it up to those of you who are listening this evening. But if we can go to this question, I think we started to go there on the last discussion. This is a huge question for both of you, Rick and Michael. The question is this: given the power of archetypes in the human psyche, what can you say about the issue of free will and determinism? And of course, this comes right on the heels of talking about the complex, which also is a determiner of free will. Are we puppets of the archetypes? Can we simply choose what archetypes we want? I don't know which of you would like to go first on that one. That's a huge.
You want to start?
Oh, no, it's your turn, Michael. I think I was just talking, so please feel free.
I remember when we were living in Vermont, I got a brochure one day about a workshop happening, and it said, change your childhood. Let's change your childhood. And they saw that as a very creative way to approach your life, that whatever your story was, change your story, change it. Now, the issue of free will, determinism, it's a loaded piece. One of the things I found in my work is I've been looking a lot at replicative systems. That's what drove my book, the whole first book I did, looking at replication in the natural world and the psyche. And it was a really wonderful, wonderful ride, going back to Freud, Jung, to new sciences, Theodore Reich, and repetition in the natural world. And I remember when I started giving lectures, one day somebody asked me a question about it. One of the students who ran a student newspaper said, you know, what's the big takeaway from this about repetition, replication? And I said, well, the good news is that repetition conserves natural tendencies. And that's part of something that Sheldrake said, that repetition and replication has a conservative nature, conservative in the sense that it conserves natural form, and it repeats it and presents it anew many times. The other piece from, again, I'll put my clinical hat on, and also as like you, Rick, an observer of culture and the collective. All too often we are caught without knowing it in these replicative dramas. And when you're caught in the vortex of an archetypal drama, at that moment there's not free will. It's eclipse. You go back to that word eclipse. And so much of the actions are the actions of the archetypal field that you're in. And there are so many powerful stories, examples, myth, fairy tales, life, whatever that we can, hopefully in Eranos we'll talk about some of these examples, but as Laurie, it is a very important question. And I think the work is, and one of my colleagues said it best, he said, you know, the difference is, this is Dr. Richard Ott, our director of studies, he may be on the call tonight. He said the difference between fate and destiny is character. And I found that so deeply meaningful, so profound, because fate means you're pulled. Go back to the analogy of the boats, Rick, you mentioned earlier, you know, that if it's fate, the analogy would be in a boat, you want to go to the shore over there. Maybe it's official, that's where the restaurant is you want to go, but the wind's blowing you that way. So you just go where the wind's blowing you. Destiny is working with the winds of nature, the winds of fate, the archetypal winds, to say, look, we want to go, take our family out for dinner tonight. We need to really throttle up and get the motor going, or get the sails going. We got to go that way to try it. And if you look at the life of an individual and the collective, many, many times, more so than we ever want to realize, we become taken over by these archetypes. And at those times, those segments of our life, those phases of our life, sometimes a whole life, are taken down. And we don't emerge out of that chrysalis. And you know, the chrysalis could hold that potential to make a new life, make a beautiful form, make all these wonderful potentials, make them real and bring them to fruition. But many times that the work of individuation, the work of becoming conscious of what the patterns of our lives are, the patterns that are living our life, may be too much for some people. I mean, look, let's be real. I mean, I think any of us that were painfully truthful in this conversation, or any conversation, would say we know what it's like to be taken over by an archetypal field or by a complex. And you say, I just can't seem to find my way out of this right now. And then hopefully with work, analysis, love, somebody loving us, and then maybe you get down on your knees and you pray and you hope and you pray for grace to hit your life and something can change. And I'm saying this not to be dramatic, but to really emphasize the tremendous power of working with that vortex of an archetypal power. I mean, I think I said in the first talk, ultimately all this work I think on archetypes is really about energy. It's energy. And this notion of we're just going to change our archetypes, look, to me, I think it's, I'll be frank, I think it comes out of, it's a fear-based reaction, put it that way. It's a fear-based reaction. We're going to change who we are, change our archetypes. But if you're not going to change your archetype, you can hopefully change some alignment through a lot of work, but you don't dial it in. You know, you go to the roulette table and, you know, you shoot craps and say, I want a new archetype. This is silly. Because the archetype that takes over a life, as we said in the opening piece about where change can happen, it's ultimately, it does have the potential for something deeply transformative when you see where you're caught. I mean, how many of the stories of the dark night of the soul, or it's because you're caught and you feel like you can't get out. You feel like your life is just going to hell in a handbasket or situation. And you know, I know I went through one, and many people have, where you feel like this situation is bigger than me. I can't handle this one. And you You turn to people who love you, and you turn to prayer or whatever you need to do, but something. And you say, I hope to God I can make this transition. Because I remember saying one time, this feels bigger than me. And I remember that. And then I'm a survivor. I grew up in the streets of Brooklyn. I'm a survivor, you know. But once it felt bigger than me, some issue. And they can take you down. So, Laura, I think in terms of your question, I think the illusion, I think it's part of what I gave in a lecture one year called the grand deception of humanity. You know, that we're going to change all this stuff. We're going to make it all different. Free will is part of the treasure hard to attain that Neumann speaks about. The ability to engage the archetypal world, to work with it, to dance with it. That's a gift. And that doesn't just come with the turf. It doesn't just come with the territory. I've been an analyst now for 35 years. We work with similar issues in different domains, right? And I see what it's like when somebody's taken over by one of these, by a complex or by an archetype, and the work and the angst and the joy that comes when you see it break open. I mean, it's like the birth of a child when it happens. Something comes out of this thing and you say, my God, here's life again. But it's work. So I think when you say, well, let's do a workshop, we're going to change who we are, we're going to change our archetypes, I say, you know what, I'd rather watch the baseball game tonight. I'm not interested. Because it doesn't seem the least bit respectful to the ontological core of an archetype. Archetypes are not to be played with. It's not parlor games. It's not put a little name tag on. What archetype are you today? Well, today I am, and tomorrow I'm going to be this. Come on, you know. That doesn't capture the profundity that Jung and the early Jungians had with this stuff. Osterman, you say you knew. I mean, I love her work. There's a profundity that goes with a recognition and an acknowledgement that these things are real. We don't just change it. We work with it, and we can change the alignments we have, and change the fact that we're possessed by it. But you're not going to dial us in like a game. So I think the most important thing, just said, oh, shut up, I'm sorry. It's a very, very meaningful question and something I care a lot about. I think it's fear-based, Laura. I think ultimately it's fear-based, that belief system that we're going to come and change our archetype. It's fear-based. I mean, we always want to say there's no boogeyman under the bed because there's nothing there. Well, sometimes there are boogeymen under the bed. It's real, you know. Rick, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm thinking in the circles that I live in, sort of the counterculture here in the Bay Area, and more generally in the many Jungian associations and their communities, I think we're all on the side of kind of re-enchanting the psyche and re-enchanting the cosmos, the world, and recognizing the soul and things, and recognizing the anima mundi and the soul of the world and its power. But our task is not simply to rediscover the anima mundi, to recover our connection to it. That's huge. That's very important. But it's also to forge a new way of relating to it.
Yeah.
And you know, you mentioned, Michael, how when that free will and suddenly, like for example, the return of some freedom after having been completely imprisoned within a very dark space, for example, or a complex that is a kind of jail, a kind of prison sentence, and then suddenly there's a release, and one kind of has one's capacity for living freely in a new way, like a birth of a child that suddenly can move about in the world. And I think you used the word that's a gift in a certain way, that when that happens. Well, gifts are also archetypal. And in a sense, we have in the great mythic traditions a recognition that free will itself is a gift of the gods. And often there's a particular god that carries that. For example, Prometheus is the liberator within the Greek frame of reference, or within the Judaic and Christian, it's both, God as the liberator and giving the gift of free will to humanity, and with all the pluses and minuses that go with that, and then Christ also bringing a new freedom within the Christian tradition. So we have these powerful mythic frames of reference and archetypal frames of reference that both honor the power of the archetypal and the possibility of a kind of freedom. And I think if we see our own challenge as having something to do with neither erring on the side of that inflated sense, like I am just the captain of my soul and in charge of my destiny, and I don't care that the wind is blowing 100 miles an hour, I'm going to move my boat in that direction. And maybe not. Maybe that's not going to happen. And so partly it's a matter of honoring that power and going with it. It's also, I think, recognizing that the archetypes are so richly multidimensional and multivalent. They have very noble as well as ignoble potentials. They have profound as well as trivial potentials. And our task as human beings with this special gift of a certain kind of freedom of consciousness is to be able to interact with those powerful archetypal forces and participate in them in such a way that we can play a role in bringing forth the most life-enhancing potential of that archetypal power. And that's an important. We have to keep from either erring on the side of all ego, which gets very inflated, because basically you take the whole archetypal realm and put it inside yourself, and then that's where the destruction happens. Where humanity thinks, or human beings think, that they are the only conscious game in town with powers of intelligence and purposefulness and so forth. But then there's the other side where it's all submission. It's all a kind of whatever happens and just going with it. There's some deep coincidence of opposites, holding that coincidence of opposites between freedom and the power of the universal, and to in some sense play a role in participating in the expression, the embodiment, the manifestation of that archetypal universal in such a way that that we bring forth the best possible result. I think in some sense the gods are depending on us to play our role and not just to lie down, so to speak. Our consciousness is not just a wrong turn. It's not just an accident. It's like we've got a destiny.
Well, thank you, Rick and Michael. Those are wonderful answers to a huge question that I'm sure will be talked about much more at Eranos. So we have about 10 minutes remaining right now, and I see someone has their hand raised. So I'd like us to segue, and thank you both for this conversation. And I just want to recognize that, what we're talking about tonight, what you both are talking about, is your respective life's work, both Michael's and yours, Rick, that this is in fact your life's work. And I just want to acknowledge that what you both bring to the table in these conversations is enormous, and the respect that you both have for this work, and the recognition that it is work done with both a personal and a collective, a moral mandate, a sense of humility that you bring to this. Those in and of themselves, I think, are gifts. I think they're the gifts of wisdom, among other things. So I want to thank you both for that. And I want to now turn to, let me just see, we have someone on the board. Let me see, Bruce, I see your hand. Let me see if it will allow you to talk, because I'm So you can ask a question. Hold on one second. It's not going to let me. So Bruce, I see your hand raised. If you can, at this point, if you have a question, if you can type your question in on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'm happy to share those. I think Rick and Michael can both see those questions as well. So questions from those of you, we have a large crowd with us tonight. If you can type a question or a comment in for either Rick or Michael, either on the chat bar or on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
I think you've done a good job, Laura Lee, of answering. I saw one of the questions there was to make sure, clarify that some of the authors that we've been speaking of, and that the person that Michael was talking about was Elizabeth Osterman. I think she might have two N's in her name, but I'm not remembering. But anyway, at the end of the name. But in any case, Elizabeth Osterman, who died about 10 years ago and was one of the very early members here of the San Francisco Jung Institute, and we both lived on Mount Tamalpais here in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, and yeah, I had a very high regard for her, and was glad when she let me know that she had just finished Passion of the Western Mind and wanted to talk about it. Do we have any questions?
Well, Bruce is typing in, and Bruce, I'm not sure if I'm understanding. Maybe Rick and Michael will, but the question is this: where is the Rainmaker in this? I don't know, Bruce, if you can maybe elaborate on what you mean by Rainmaker.
It's probably the Rainmaker, the myth of the Rainmaker, I would imagine.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I think where is the Rainmaker in all this? God, yeah. I think right now it's hope, Bruce. I don't know. We have a Rainmaker right now. I mean, I just saw another question right above his. Judith Asper, I've known for many years. She said, as we talk right now, America's dropping bombs on Syria. Did you see that?
Yeah.
I didn't know that was happening right now. Oh my God. So where's the Rainmaker? You know, somewhere I think we got to have hope. And Jung struggled with this. One little story. He said, one time he had all of his great students around him in a seminar. They said, well, Dr. Jung, we've learned so much about psyche. What do we do about the world now? And he began untying his shoe. You know that story, right? He began untying his shoe. They said, well, he must be getting older to hear us. He was sort of the latter part of his life. And they said, Dr. Jung, we've been studying. We know about our own dreams. We know about our psyches, our complexes. What do we do about the world situation? And he took his shoe off, took a rock out of it, and threw it away. Anyway, he said, why don't you listen to us, old man? Talk to us. And he said, I just did. First thing to do is see where it's in your own foot. Where are the issues in your own psyche first? Now, I know that goes against the grain of a lot of political activists, but somewhere, if we could do a little piece of work on ourselves every day and see where we're caught, and how we make the transition, the transformation Rick just talked about in terms of archetypes, I think it's a big step. And as an analyst, you know what I learned about it? And I've been doing this work 35 years. I have more than ever taken to heart an expression my father said to me in Sicilian growing up. He said, "Pazienza, figlio mio. Pazienza, figlio mio." Patience, my son. Patience. I don't have a lot of patience. I've never had it. But as I get older, I'm beginning to have more patience with the process that you stick in, you hold in there, you do your best to understand, articulate, read patterns, pray, all that kind of stuff, and hope to God that we can get there. But I think right now I personally feel like we're in rough shape.
Well, I think you make a great point, Michael. I mean, Jung was the one who said the masses are not changed unless the individual is changed. And I think you and Rick have both spoken to that. So thank you. We've got a number of other questions.
I could respond to a couple, just to finish up with Bruce. He adds the point, I do not make it rain, I make a place for it to rain. I think that's very it's
a great line.
that gets to the heart of it, that the we're all in that position where we can't determine our reality with a kind of engineering control, but we can make a proper space for the birth to take place in. We can, and I think that's sometimes that's like to create the temenos, to create the alchemical crucible, to bring in the right attitudes of openness, of discernment, of humility, of hope. I think hope is an enormously important quality that you just brought up, Michael. It can play a role in constellating the future. It's not just like helping me in the present. It actually can help invite in the future in the same way that in a difficult point in an intimate relationship, for example, having the hope that there could be an outcome to whatever difficulty the relationship is in, that could actually allow the relationship to blossom on another level. Having that hope itself plays a role in the possibility of that more positive outcome to happen. So that's a couple of thoughts about that.
I love the piece about the remake you said. Say it again, Rick, that line.
Well, that was Bruce's addition, and what he said was,
I do not make it rain. I make a place for it to rain.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
So creating the conditions within which transformation can happen, creating the temenos that makes room for the hope and the love.
Beautiful. It's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah. So Natalia has asked the shortest overview on new transits that are coming in the closest future that she directed to me. Well, because we only have a couple minutes, I can hardly even begin it. I could just say like that really big Uranus-Pluto alignment that we've been in since 2007 approximately, and will go on for another about 3 more years. But during these next 3-4 years or so, we are also getting a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which has a very powerful dynamic of its own. Much more potent activation of the Senex archetype of Saturn, of certain gravitas. The reality principle tends to really present itself with great force. Often important trials, important judgments are made. Sometimes like a kind of moral judgment that can come sometimes in the solemn way of a trial, like the Nuremberg trials took place under the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Watergate took place under a Saturn-Pluto. So, yeah, I think to do better justice to this, I think I'll just refer you in the meantime. Certainly we'll go into it in much greater detail when we go to Eranos, but in the meantime, on my cosmosanpsyche.com website, there is there's a page of essays there, and you can just look at that essay that's called World Transits 2000 to 2020, a brief overview. That looks at these basic energies and gives a bit of a sense for where we are, what we've just been through, and what's coming. And then for those of you who are really ambitious, the larger book, Cosmos and Psyche, is a source that you could draw on.
Thank you. Okay, so our time is up, and there's an excellent question on the board. Kathy is asking, would you give us some thoughts about how to work within an archetypal complex in order to bring about its most life-enhancing form? Some anecdotes. I love the idea, but it's not easy to do. Yes, Kathy, we're right there with you, working within a complex. Okay, Michael, you want to answer that in 30 seconds or less?
I mean, if you have a safe container, say, again, a marriage, hopefully safe, or ideally a therapy, what helps a lot is being able to really see not only the contours, but the nucleus of that complex. I mean, let it out. I mean, you say, well, some people call it the inner critic, whatever. That's one example, right? Let it come out. And with safety, though, to see the power of what this thing does and how it works on your psyche, how it may interfere. The other side, I'll give a personal piece. I mean, complex is not bad, remember? Complex, the best definition I ever heard, it's a quantum energy organized around a theme. Could be good, bad, or whatever. I'll give you an example of a good complex. I've been studying Italian for years. I lecture Italian and English. I love Italian, and I'm going back. I'm doing lessons 3 times a week again because I really have a dream of being an Italian scholar. Right? Who was asking the question? What's her name?
Kathy.
Kathy. When I do my lessons, I work on my Italian. Something comes over me that's so powerful. And I know it's arrogant to talk that way, but it feels like what one might call God or something transcendent. It's a complex. And I know it's looking to shape my life. And I let it in. I begin feeling it. I do it. I go back to my work. And I know what it's like when I can't do it. You work a 12, 13-hour day. You're too tired to do anything but have a glass of wine and go to sleep. But you're not attending to that love, a part of your love of your life. So I would say give energy in a safe way to whatever it is that feels like it's complexing around you, what has an autonomous force. And that's one part of the complex. I mean, Jung talks about it as splinter personalities. So it's very powerful stuff. But you need a safe environment to do it in. So I would say.
Well, thank
and
you.
one thing, Gloria, the comment that Judith Asper made, is it true we're bombing right now? You know, Rick, anything about it?
Oh, I just the thing that came across my screen was just more like something saying that it was announced that it would happen or may happen or something like that with greater specificity against the chemical weapons plants in Syria. Anyway,
just say
everybody will know as soon as they get off this. Off of our webinar, they'll be able to look on all the news that is being pushed at us.
Let's hope to God someday this madness is going to stop all of it. But it's archetypal.
On that note, I want to say thank you. Thank you first and foremost to Michael and to Rick for sharing your life's work. And thank you for all those of you who are joining with us to create this Temenos on a Friday evening in a world that is in a collective upheaval, and where there are archetypal forces that are directing destinies of nations and of individuals. And I think, the hope, the rainmaker, the hope is the degree to which, as Michael and Rick both emphasized this evening, the degree to which each of us takes to heart this work, and takes it beyond that place of simply intellectualizing and theorizing to really making the application. I think tonight, Rick and Michael, you've brought us into that place, and I'm not trying to be inflationary, but I think when we're in this world of the archetypal, in the sense that Jung brought it to us, we enter into holy ground in some respects. We're entering into a recognition that these are forces that are bigger than us necessarily, and we need to take off our shoes. In recognition, take off our shoes and recognize that we engage with them, and from a place of deep humility and respect. And so this evening, I want to encourage those of you to, if you haven't given yourself a gift this year, if you didn't get what you wanted at Christmas time or your birthday, your husband just didn't come through for you, or your wife just didn't come through for you, give yourself a gift to get to Eranos this summer, to sit in what is going to be, I think, an unbelievable Temenos, and to engage more deeply with these themes, and to give yourself the time for reflection and engagement in coming together as a group, but in a very personal way, in an individual way. And I want to leave us with this quote tonight, if I may. And this is coming actually from the video Matters of the Heart, and it's coming from Emma Young. And she says this: in our time when such threatening forces of cleavage are at work, splitting peoples, individuals, and atoms, it is doubly necessary that those which unite and hold together should become effective. For life is founded on the harmonious interplay of masculine and feminine forces within the individual human being as well as without. Bringing these opposites into union is one of the most important tasks of present day psychotherapy. So bringing ourselves together, masculine and feminine, within this archetypal world and within this collective world. Thank you, Michael and Rick.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily. Great work.
What you're doing for all of you. Please get in touch, TonyDianca.com. Sooner rather than later, the hotels will be filling up, and we'd love to have you join with all of us, and Yvonne as well, who will be there with Rick at Eranos. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night. Thank you. Good night, Rick.
Thank you. Good night, Michael. Laura Lee. Thank you very much, Laura Lee, for moderating us.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.